Hello, everyone, and welcome to Safe Havens' 2019 webinar series, which we've called What's Faith Got to Do with It? Supporting Victims and Survivors of Faith. I'm Anne Marie Hunter, and with me today are my colleagues Allison Morse-Katzman, Katie Oitman, and Karen Liu. And just a brief thing on Safe Havens, we're faith-based, we're multi-religious, we're a TA provider for OVW, and we provide support for advocates and service providers about how to reach out and partner with local faith leaders and faith communities so that we can serve victims and survivors better. We're based in Boston and we work locally and nationally, so please feel free to contact us if you're interested in resources or technical assistance or training or anything like that on building relationships with your local faith leaders. So we are deeply, deeply indebted and grateful to OVW for the funding to do this work. Yeah, it's groundbreaking work, and we're very honored to be able to do it. So since February, we've had this webinar series going on. It has been looking at sexual and domestic violence through the lens of various cultures and faith traditions, including our first webinar about why faith is important to faith-affiliated survivors to begin with. Then we've looked at spirituality, sexual violence and healing, domestic violence through a Christian lens, domestic and sexual violence from an African-American perspective, and today's webinar was presented in Spanish earlier this week. All of the webinars in this series will be recorded and posted to the Safe Havens website, so I encourage you to take a look at those. So today's number 7 in the 9 webinar series, and today's title is Our Faith, Our Strength, Supporting Latinx Victims and Survivors of Domestic Violence. And today's presenter is from Casa de Esperanza, a national Latinx organization whose mission is to mobilize Latinas and Latinx communities to end domestic violence. They're based in a really beautiful space, and I say that knowingly because we just visited last November, in St. Paul, Minnesota, and 34 years of direct service experience, so very well experienced, and they've developed a really wonderful philosophy and approach that's grounded in the strengths and realities and values of Latinos, as well as the knowledge that family and community are central and vibrant and important part of the fabric of Latinx life. So since 2005, Casa has been a comprehensive TA provider for OVW, and we are really, really looking forward to today's presentation. With us today is Paula Gomez-Storti, who is the Senior Director of Training and Technical Assistance at Casa. She was born in Boston to Chilean parents and has lived in Boston and Chile all her life. She's worked with survivors in courts and hospitals and shelters, and her advocacy has led to institutional changes, which is all important, institutional changes that have increased the inclusion and safety of survivors. So, Paula, we're so grateful to you today, and really looking forward to the presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. It's a pleasure to join you this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are in the country, folks that are listening. I'm just going to get started here and go through the presentation, and then maybe we can wait for questions at the end of the presentation. And also I'd love to hear from folks who have joined on what they're doing in their own communities. As Anne-Marie said, my name is Paula Gomez-Storti, and I'm Senior Director of Training and TA for the National Latino Network for Healthy Families and Communities of Casa de Esperanza. And my colleague Yvette is not able to join us today, so I will be doing the webinar. You can follow us on social media through Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. We are also are on YouTube as well. And so Casa de Esperanza was started by a small group of Latinas, about 4 Latinas activists in St. Paul, Minnesota in 1982. and it has grown to be the premier Latino domestic violence organization in the country. And I just had the pleasure, I was there yesterday for a breakfast that we had and invited the community, and I had the honor of meeting one of the founders. She was there that started Casa de Esperanza, and basically these 4 Latinas came together and talked about the importance of cultural relevant approach, and that was missing at the time in 1982 with most domestic violence services in St. Paul, Minnesota. So they came together and started Casa de Esperanza. The mission is to mobilize Latino communities to end domestic violence. And the 5 core values that we have is Latina leadership, and that we really are guided by the wisdom of Latinas, and entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship in the sense of the way we approach our responses are maybe thinking sometimes outside of the box. And that's it with creativity and really responding to survivors. And if a service doesn't work for a survivor, we would really listen and respond to how that would work. And the result is something different. So that's what we mean by entrepreneurship. Organizational excellence is that we strive for excellence in what we do, and we live free of violence, and that we know that there is violence in our communities and sometimes in our relationships, and that we strive to live a life free of violence, that we don't perpetuate violence or act in violent ways, and we're reflective about our behavior and our thoughts and words, that they are free of violence. And very importantly, that our solutions are community-driven, and that we listen to community. We listen to the impact of the abuse of violence that violence has had in the community, and we do that. We do that often by listening sessions, where we listen to the community and they guide us. And so, as I stated, community has the answers. We recognize it is the community that will end domestic violence, not any system or organization, and that we acknowledge that systems are important and organizations are important. They have resources and they support survivors. However, really the power is in the community coming together and ending violence. And we emphasize developing social capital. That's really important, to have trust, reciprocity, information, and cooperation, because we believe it decreases domestic violence. As we know, working with survivors, they are often isolated, and that isolation perpetuates domestic violence. And so if there is social capital, if an individual has support from the community, and the community has that support with one another, that will decrease domestic violence. So the National Latino Network for Healthy Families and Communities is a project, as I mentioned, of Casa de Esperanza that is working to end domestic violence and promote health and well-being of the Latino communities around the country. We are a national resource center funded through FIPSA, which is a division of Health and Human Services. And within the NLN, we have 3 components, and one is public policy in DC. We have 2 staff in DC. We have a research department. We also have staff, our research staff is in Atlanta, and then training and technical assistance. And we are all over the country. I'm based out of Boston. As I mentioned, some folks are in Atlanta, Florida, California, Texas. We have Austin, Dallas, and Austin, Dallas, and Houston. And then we also have someone in Puerto Rico, Iowa, Ohio. So we are everywhere across the country providing training and technical assistance as a resource center. So before we get started, I wanted to talk a little bit about Latinas in the United States. And as you see, 57.7 million Latinos live in the U.S. And so that is almost 18% of the population. It is a heterogeneous group. That means we are not all the same. The Latino community is very diverse. There are 22 countries in the world that speak Spanish. And so that means that there are 22 countries that have their own culture and history, and the language, although it may be Spanish, it is spoken differently. We know here in the United States we may sound different depending where we're coming from. It's funny, when I go to Minnesota, every Uber driver that I've encountered, when they ask me where I'm from, I say Boston. They say, well, you don't sound like you're from Boston. And I say, I can if you want me to. So similarly to Spanish, Spanish sounds different depending on the country, and the words may be different. And so when I speak Spanish, I say, well, when I say this word, I mean this. Is that what you mean? So I make sure that I understand what someone is saying. We do this even when we're speaking Spanish. Many families have mixed immigration status. 75% of children in immigrant families are U.S. citizens. And so that may mean that the parents may not have status, and the children do have status. So it's a mixed status home. And so there's lots of fear that immigrants who are undocumented experience. They fear deportation. And they may have limitations. They may limit themselves because of that fear. Some folks are afraid to drive because a traffic violation may have them deported. If the police department has communication with ICE, that may result in deportation. And so that means that within a family, there may be individuals that may have resources and others that may not within the family. And so our organizational commitment to the way we do the work is that, if you see here on the slide, Latina experiencing violence in their families is central. It is in the center of what we do. And the advocate is supporting that survivor, but as well as the organization. And so if Latinas are at the center and the support is in response to what that Latina needs, the organization needs to support that advocate, providing that support that may look different. And so not only is the Latina experiencing the abuse, but what is the reality of the Latina? Is she living in a mixed status home? Is she first generation, second generation Latina? Does she have family in her country of origin or children, and that are impacted by the violence as well? Sometimes we've heard Latinos say, my partner said, I can pay someone $50 and they'll hurt your family. And so that to be thinking that the reality of a Latina and experience is not only in this country, but in the country of origin as well. And so to have a bigger picture of looking at her systems of support. Culture. As we see on the slide, the culture is a pattern of beliefs, attitudes, behavior that are transmitted from one generation to another generation, and that allows us to adapt to each other and the environment. And so what that means is the culture that we all have culture because we all live in an environment. The environment, we adapt to the environment, and the environment is always changing, therefore culture is always changing. We know that in our culture, in the United States, things are different. The way we fly, if we have gone to an airport before 9/11 and after 9/11, it's very different, right? Years and years ago, and I'm dating myself, we didn't have cell phones. There was typically a phone in the kitchen with a long cord, and we didn't have much privacy. Our language has changed because of cell phones. I mean, we didn't know what texting was years ago. There was no internet. We called for information. We picked up the phone and dialed 411. And so our culture changes because the environment changes. We change and accommodate to our environment. This is a broad definition of cultural orientation. But there are, if we look at two types of culture, when we look at the group-oriented culture, it's a culture that includes storytelling and a narrative. And an individualistic culture is the bottom line and bullet list. And so primarily for Latino culture, it is group-oriented. As an individual, we're not just the individual. We're an individual as we relate to others. Our identity is shaped by the group, by the family. And so I am not the only one that makes decisions about me. And in order for me to make a decision, it is important that I consult with my family or my group or my circle, our community. And so group-oriented culture is about storytelling. In order to answer you, I have to tell you a little bit. I have to give you the context so that you understand. And if you understand, then you can support me and I could trust you. Individualistic culture is bottom line, is questions and answers. And so if I ask a question to receive knowledge, I'm expecting an answer. And so the dialogue will start with a question and then an answer, then a question and an answer. And so if someone from an individualistic culture is speaking to someone from a group-oriented culture, it may be a little problematic where you're not finding the answers. If you're expecting an answer to a question, you are then encountered by a story. It impacts that communication. Our institutions are individualistic in terms of we have to answer in complete intakes. Our law enforcement system, if you're in front of a judge trying to get a restraining order, it is important that the survivor speaks with an advocate in order to make sure that the survivor is answering with the elements of what that judge is looking for to issue that restraining order. And so it's important to know that the way in which we communicate may be different, and that it's important to us to have that understanding that difference exists. And so because difference exists, there's a possibility that the person that I am supporting may communicate differently than I do. And so when I have that understanding, I can then be open to different possibilities, and then I can mirror the person's approach. The community is central to us, to survivors and to the Latino community. And community looks different, and families look different. That families, it's not only the nucleus, it could be godmothers and aunties that are not blood related, but they're aunts as well. Oh, let me go back. Essential cultural orientations. And so, as I mentioned before, it's not the I, it's the we, and sometimes it's both. And what I want to stress is that, as I mentioned before, a Latina could be first generation or second generation. Second generation, the Latina has parents that come from another Latino country, and the individual has lived here and has been socialized here, and so may have these individualistic ways of speaking or seeing the world, as well as having a group-oriented. And so that is biculturalism, right? And so that there's two cultures at play within the individual. And so they may see themselves as I or we, or individuals might see themselves as I. If I go into a shelter, I am only thinking of me. If I have to go into a shelter and I live with my mother, it is essential that my mother come with me because she's also been impacted by the abuse. In terms of worth, the worth that an individual has, is it by doing or being? Group-oriented cultures value the being of the individual. Individualistic cultures value the doing. And in our language, we hear, how are you doing? When we see someone, hi, how are you? How are you doing? Or if we meet someone, we say, oh, this is, we exchange our names, and then the next question potentially is, what is your, what is it that you do? And in terms of boundaries, and I see this especially in our field, is that our boundaries are different. Group-oriented cultures don't have those strict boundaries. Greeting is, with a kiss and a hug. And individualistic culture, that is limited. And that is a sense of showing respect and that giving someone their personal space and not invading their personal space. And so to show respect by having distance from that individual. And so someone may be respectful, and that may land as cold if someone is coming from another culture. And so, again, it could be knowing that when interacting with an individual, there's a difference. And in our field, we're taught to have boundaries and to have strong boundaries, and that is a professional way of supporting survivors, to have boundaries. And with some cultures, that may conflict. And so that a way to navigate that is to, again, observe the individual. If the individual reaches out and in conversation touches our knee or our arm, is to respond to that. I know it's been tricky for me when working with Latinas at first, not knowing if I should greet them with a kiss, and to really read them that they were going in for a kiss, and I've done that, right, just to kiss and hug and say hello, and to say when, I'm here for you, and to touch them if it was natural to do so, but that the survivor leads me, right, and so I have to be present and observe. As I said before, the family expands beyond the nucleus, and that also in immigrant families and households, that others may come to the home in supporting other immigrant families. You could have individuals that are newcomers stay with you while they get on their feet. Cousins and uncles and aunts are as siblings and parents, and that elders are very important in the family as well. So why do people migrate? I think that there's incredible strength of individuals that would leave everything behind, everything that they know, and go to a new environment. And a big reason is to reunite with family, with family that has already left the country, for economic opportunities, if there's hardship in the country, and to leave to a better economy. There could be educational opportunities to receive a visa to study abroad. Others are fleeing persecution if there's political warfare in a country, or someone's identity is putting them at risk and they're fleeing that persecution, or they're fleeing intimate partner abuse. For whatever reason, and even in the best circumstances of that immigration, there's an experience of loss. If someone comes in a visa, educational visa, and studying at Harvard and first class, and so if you think of the best circumstance, there is an experience of loss. You're losing a lot. So you're losing family, friends, your language, the way you express yourself, which is part of your identity. Some lose their identity if they had a profession in the country of origin. They're losing their community and their connectivity to others. They're losing their agency, the ability to get up and go and to decide what they'd like to do and where they'd like to go, and their social activities. So in this slide, it says in the best circumstances of immigration. I want to point out that there are other circumstances of immigration that might be very difficult, that because there was political warfare or experienced poverty or experienced violence, that they have to leave without legal status, without a visa. They may not have enough money for that and may leave for survival. And in that, they are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to others that are helping them come over, that they, when crossing over a border, they may experience sexual assault, theft, violence. They may lose family members. I've heard of survivors who have lost children when crossing the border, being hit by a truck while crossing. And so when we are working and supporting individuals that are experienced, that have come to this country, if they express to you the way in which it happened, there's a possibility that there's violence and trauma. In terms of Latinos in the United States, in terms of religion, 55% would be Catholic, 18% unaffiliated, 22% Protestant. Evangelical is 16%. And so what I wanted to show in this slide is that, yes, there's a large population that is Catholic within the Latino community, but I also want to note that there is diversity within religion and even folks that may be atheist. However, faith is part of our cultural identity. As I mentioned before, we're heterogeneous, we're diverse, and there's a large religious representation of Catholic and Christian with origins of Spanish colonization in Central and South America, and as well as the Caribbean. It was infused in our culture. It's part of our culture, and there are sometimes representations of saints and the Virgin Mary as symbols and source of strength and solace. And so my memory of my grandmother is that she always had the Virgin Mary. She had the Virgin Mary and a picture of the Pope in the dining room credenza. And so there was always rosaries, or to put a medallion of the Virgin Mary or Saint Joseph. And if you're missing something or you want to find something, it could be something, concrete, or it could be having the right opportunity come to you. She would say, St. Anthony, St. Anthony, St. Anthony. And when I was little, she'd say, if you really want something, you pray to the Virgin Mary, because that's Jesus' mother, and Jesus can't say no to his mother. So the Virgin Mary is very important. It's a very important symbol. And it's often something that we see everywhere we go in Latin America. Prayer chains within churches and communities are forms of support and mobilization. And also now I see often I'm connected with Chilean pages, and the request to ask, for support and to pray, and for there to be a prayer chain for an individual that's going through a hard time. The faith communities provide spirituality, but also practical supports to individuals and their families. And when individuals come to the United States and are looking for a community, the community is so essential, will often reach out to churches, even if they weren't practicing, because the church also has sources of support, orientation and resources of where to go to register your children to school, where to go to find a job, or resources like furniture. And there's also a community there that can support that individual that often feels isolated. As Cesar Chavez said, when you have people come together who believe in something very strongly, whether it's religion, politics, or union, things happen. So I say this, I put the slide because by engaging in faith-based communities and being in line with our views of social justice and safety and community, there are lots of things that we can do for our community and make our community safe by coming together. Religious leaders have advocated for the human rights of individuals in Latin America, and as religious leaders, being caring and being committed to the safety and the well-being of individuals, of the community, it is natural for them to be involved and to be activists. And as a result of that, sometimes they themselves have been incarcerated. But it's wanted to point out that within political warfare, different countries, religious leaders have always been involved in the human justice of our community. So examples of collaborative support with survivors, I've been doing this work over 25 years and in different capacities working with survivors, and knowing that faith is a part of individuals, not all individuals, but it's a possibility that is a part of an individual, a strong part that brings often support and comfort. I have always asked an individual about that as a source of support. As an advocate, we meet with an individual and then worry. We worry when they're at risk, and oftentimes when we know they have a support system, we feel better as advocates. So knowing that if they are connected with their faith community, that they have support systems. And so years ago, well, now like, I don't know, 18 years ago, like 1998, my colleague and I started a hospital-based domestic violence program. And we were charged with training nurses and doctors on how to screen. And it took a while, but we had a program going and then had really good relations with the staff and the institution. And I was called, when I was program director later on, I was called by the hospital directly. And I just happened to be on call that evening, and they asked me to respond to a murder, suicide. And I come to the hospital, and the victim was 22 years old, and her partner was about the same. They were both very young, and their families were in the emergency room. And so I quickly had to ask who was the victim, and the mother of the victim was there. She only spoke Spanish. I told her who I was and what I did, that I was there to support her. And she was obviously upset, and I was also giving her information about what was happening. She only wanted her grandkids to be with her. And after I sort of oriented her into what was going on and that DCF was coming, because I had a relationship with the chaplain in the hospital, I offered that. I said, there are services here in the hospital. Would you like to speak with the chaplain? And she did. And the chaplain came, and the three of us prayed. And at that moment, even though it was so difficult, it did ease her. It did ease her. She wanted at first to take her mask off, and after she had participated in prayer, it gave her some peace at that moment. And so as an advocate, I knew that that was a possibility and it would help her, and that I knew that when she was talking with individuals and interacting with individuals, it was a crisis. It was her first time. It was important for her to be connected. We've done co-advocacy as well. As a program director, we were charged with starting a Portuguese outreach program within the North Shore, advocate who was fantastic, had connections with faith leaders in the Portuguese-speaking community. And there was a survivor that left home to go to speak with her pastor, and only that's how she was able to get out of the house. Told the pastor, because had relationship with the organization, contacted us, and we did co-advocacy. We supported her, and we were able to connect with her sister in Brazil, and within our organization and the pastor, we were able to support her in going back to Brazil, where she wanted to be with her sister. We wouldn't be able to do that. She wouldn't have come to our doors as a domestic violence organization, but did go see her pastor. And then I was also some time a shelter director, and saw that survivors coming into the shelter, that prayer was important to them. Some of them carried Bibles, and not that there was one woman, she didn't read the Bible, but just carrying the Bible and having it in her room made her feel better. It reminded her of her family. And then also having the cultural awareness that not everybody is Christian, and we wanted to be culturally responsive and wanted to make families feel welcomed and celebrated everyone's birthday. However, there was a family who was Jehovah's Witness. They were Jehovah's Witness, and the mom said that she didn't want her children to partake in that, or any celebration of either Halloween and so forth. And so we respected and responded to that, and that helped build trust between her and shelter staff. So in terms of collaborating with faith communities, it's not always easy. We know that. I think that it's important for us to be cognizant of what our perspective is as a field, as a movement. So what is the advocacy perspective, and what is the faith leader's perspective? Not all faith leaders have the same perspective. And so knowing that perspective comes with communication and relationship building. It's important, like with any collaboration, to have that continuous opportunities of building relationships, and to know the differences and commonalities, and to be able to speak about them, and to have mutual respect, is that we're not trying to change anyone, but to know that we do have differences, and to respect those differences, I think enhances that relationship. And knowing that there are commonalities and differences, where are the opportunities that we can work together and increase safety and well-being for our community? So in St. Paul, Minnesota, Anne-Marie said she was there, and we did listening sessions in Spanish with leaders, and we had a group that came together, and we asked simple questions and brainstorming and having answers from them, and wrote them down here for you. Question number 1 was, name 1 to 3 ways you would like to collaborate with programs like Casa, Esperanza. They responded to offer educational opportunities to youth about healthy relationships and that include faith. Provide groups or workshops in the church to teach people about their rights and community resources. Provide information in Spanish instead of English with an interpreter. So meaning if there was someone who was coming to offer services in English with an interpreter, that they preferred for the information to be in Spanish. The individual must know the culture of the community. And so some of the slides earlier in the presentation, that they feel that someone knowing their culture is important, and that responses that focus the whole family are best practices. Include partner abuse information in matrimony classes or support. Question 2, do you know of an individual in your place of worship who had experienced abuse or is in an abusive relationship. Yes, there was economic abuse, there were cases where there was verbal abuse, and there was emotional and verbal abuse. Question 3, as a faith leader, how have you supported these individuals and families? Through doctrine, faith, and scriptures of support, provided information about community resources, always listened without judgment, supported them by letting them know I was also there for them to support them. 4, what resources have you offered individuals, families you have supported? Community connections, such as Multicultural Advocacy Committee, Mujeres Latina Network, Ser la Voz, resources within and outside the church, and Casa de Esperanza. A therapist, women's groups, there are resources, but sometimes not in Spanish. We have to have more services in Spanish. And that is now the end of my presentation, and I would love to engage and hear from you of ways in which you have engaged with faith-based leaders, or any questions that you may have about our process of engaging. Thank you. So the question is, can you say more about co-advocacy? Can faith leaders and advocates co-advocate? Yes, absolutely. And so the term co-advocacy with Casa de Esperanza, we've used co-advocacy in where a survivor was in a program and that program did not have staff that spoke Spanish, that we would do a partnership in that advocacy. If our shelter was full, the individual would be at that other shelter. We would check in daily. We would do advocacy and provide resources and support. And our communication with that mainstream program was essential. And so we did co-advocacy. Co-advocacy with faith leaders is very similar, in that the individual may approach that faith leader, and that faith leader contacts us for additional resources or support. And so that individual may be receiving support from their faith leaders, as well as coming to the program, participating in a support group, using the hotline, and also receiving support from the faith leader in community. Similarly, as we've done with therapists, that someone who is in therapy may be maybe discussing the abuse but other issues in therapy, and the domestic violence program, sexual assault program, is supporting around the trauma and imminent needs. In terms of this co-advocacy, it's great. We find that faith institutions, because of their position in the community, have resources that sometimes the local organization does not, and so pooling those resources is very helpful. It expands our work. It maximizes our ability to do that co-advocacy. And so it's important for faith leaders to know that we're in the community, to know what we offer, and also for us to know what services or resources they may have, and have a connection in building trust. If someone trusts you, they'll call you, right? If they know that you provide resources of support and advocacy, they will call you. And communication is important, and also making sure that the survivor is leading that process of co-advocacy, of collaboration. And so letting the survivor know of conversations that you've had, or asking the survivor for the opportunity or ability. Do you have consent to speak? To speak to the faith leader? The next question, oh, thank you. Thank you. There's another question coming.
Paula, while we're waiting for the next question, this is Anne Marie.
Yes.
Go back to something you said about being really respectful of people's faith traditions, especially within the shelter, but even in an office setting where people might be coming for support group or something like that. I just wanted to mention that, as you well know, faith can be kind of a double-edged sword at times. It's a huge resource, but there's also times when people experience spiritual abuse. Their faith tradition is misused or misinterpreted to suggest that they should just put up with abuse, or it's somehow what they're supposed to do is stay. So I just wanted to mention that sometimes we've heard from survivors who say that even if they are the same faith tradition as whatever holiday is being decorated for, I don't know how to put it, but that sometimes because that particular faith was used against them, that it can be a reminder of not happy things. In other words, it doesn't necessarily empower survivors sometimes, even when those survivors are the same faith as whatever the decoration is. So it's so important to stay really sensitive to where people are coming from on faith. Anyway.
Right. And so it's important to know that faith may be an important part of the individual's life is step one. And so because that may be an opportunity, it's an area to ask, and then someone may say no. If they say yes, it's also important to explore, as you're saying, that there's, it's not, yes, that's my faith and that's it. There's also nuances, and it could be positive and negative. And so there is diversity within that, right? And so it's the survivor that guides us on how we can best respond.
Right. Also, just for those of you on the line, we hear a lot about constitutional sort of separation of church and state issues. So Safe Haven's put together a resource that you might find helpful that's on our website about some of the constitutional considerations, but one of them is, just as Paula is saying, that when we're talking to a client about faith, that's a client-led conversation and not an advocate-led conversation.
Right.
So Paula, do you want me to read you this next question?
Sure.
I've been told that Latino abused women don't often talk about their abuse, even within their community. For example, I teach a 21-week Christ-centered recovery study, and I'm not sure if they would be comfortable attending. What do you suggest? I've been asked several times if the curriculum is available in Spanish, but now I'm not sure if Latino women would attend.
Okay. So a couple of things. I would say that the statement of Latino abused women don't often talk about their abuse. I don't agree with that statement. I think that, again, because of culture, it may be within different circumstances that they may disclose, and it is important first to establish a relationship. As I said, we're group-oriented, so a relationship of trust and of support. And even in the conversation, it may not be the first thing that someone says, and it may not be the first time in the first encounter. But if there is trust and information over time, they may disclose. In terms of a 21-week Christian-centered recovery study, it's also important not to have the words domestic violence in the group. It says recovery. Things that individuals respond to would be well-being and health of the family. We, years ago, this is a very long time, I worked at Respond Inc. It's an organization here in Massachusetts in Somerville, and at the time was largely a Central American community, and I was charged with having a support group in Spanish. And I could not put a domestic violence group. People would not show up. So I said, have a women's group that we would have coffee and cake or cookies, and that we would discuss well-being. And so we know, because of statistics of that individuals, depending on the statistic, 1 in 3 women experience abuse in their lifetime. And so we know if someone is experiencing abuse or is not experiencing abuse, they know someone. And so to speak about well-being, if someone, and that has different aspects of our well-being, our physical, emotional, psychological, that is a way to engage. It can happen.
Yes, we've experienced something similar too. Allison's chiming in and saying that this experience translates to many different communities, and I would so agree with that. I think it's really important when we're coming from a faith-based community, and now I'm speaking from the faith-based side of the picture rather than the advocacy side of the picture, that we're so careful not to blame survivors or make it sound as though somehow this was their fault. So really, really important to keep that in mind as well for any faith-based response, is that we're really careful about that. One of the things that we find is that survivors do speak up, but they're very careful where to speak up, and they kind of throw out a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of the experience to see how people will respond. And our sense of it is that often faith-based communities and faith-based responses are not helpful, or they're victim blaming or re-traumatizing or whatever, and that does shut folks down. We even had one survivor who's, we were asking her, what's your advice for faith leaders? And she said, one look from a faith leader that says, I don't want to talk about this, or I don't have time for this right now, will shut survivors down for another 20 years, which made me think that she had shut down for the first 20 years already. And so, I think folks do talk about it. It's just that sometimes the response from the community is just not helpful. And since survivors have such excellent antenna about what's safe and what isn't, they back off really quickly when something doesn't feel quite right. That's just my gut feeling about it, having talked to the folks that I've talked to.
Right.
I don't know if their experience as well.
Yes. There is a comment here in the public chat from Diane, and I want you to thank you, but I want to let Diane know and everyone to please go to our website. I'm going to go back a little bit. There's so many tools to work and engage the Latino community. Casadeesperanza.org is our the website for our services in Minnesota. Our national website is the National Latino Network.org. And Diane wrote, I live in a highly Latino agricultural community. There are so many resources on the website, Diane, that would be really beneficial to you, I think, and toolkits on how to engage the community. So that's a resource for everyone.
Thank you, Paula. That's so helpful. So Safe Havens has been working with Casa now for a couple of years, and we have found everything that they've provided to us so helpful. We had the opportunity to go out to St. Paul for a listening circle, but also to learn about how Casa does their listening circles, and it was just absolutely transformative. It was a wonderful experience. And
I'm so happy.
Yeah, I really would recommend all of their resources and even the listening circle like framework. I don't know if you have that information up on your website, Paula, but I imagine you do. And it was even just the handouts are really helpful. So.
We do. We do have community engagement. We have a toolkit there on how to provide listening sessions, and also that self-care is very important when you're doing lots of listening sessions and back-to-back, because us hearing those responses also has an impact on us as well.
Well, it's about time to wrap up, so let me advance the slides. I'm not sure how we get back to where we were. There we go. I want to thank you, Paula. This is just so helpful, and I've learned a lot myself, and also seen myself reflected, which is really wonderful and interesting, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, too, to our participants and to NCJ-FCJ for hosting today. There are 2 more upcoming webinars in our series. We'll have the opportunity to learn about abuse from a Jewish perspective on May 7th, and then exploring the implications of faith and abuse within the LGBTQIA community on May 22nd. So make sure to sign up for those if you're interested, and we would love to have all of you back. I hope you'll join us for those. And then just to let you know, we are Safe Haven's Interfaith Partnership, and we're happy to talk to you anytime. My name is Anne-Marie Hunter, and our Associate Director is Allison Morse-Katzman. This is our contact information, so give us a call or email, check our website. And again, thank you, Casa, for a wonderful, wonderful presentation. And yeah, I hope everybody reaches out both to Casa and to Safe Havens. Thank you all so much, and goodbye until next time.
Thank you. My pleasure.